Okay, so what drives people's impulses? Now, traditional economics starts from the premise of methodological individualism. So in other words, Homo economicus lives in a vacuum. But of course, the key insight from the other social sciences is that much of human behavior is influenced by the culture that we live in and the narratives that we're exposed to. So, for example, the psychologist Paul DiMaggio and the psychologist Hazel Marcus write that people think and feel and act in ways that are shaped by particular patterns of historically derived meanings, practices, products, and institutions. Now, psychology, sociology, and anthropology obviously have very rich insights to offer on this. But as a reductionist economist, I'm going to again boil it down to a single number. So Q is the probability that another person has the same impulse. It's a measure of the extent to which people use the same cultural mental models. So this produces a simple dichotomy. So if Q is large, so close to 1, then we have a strong homogeneous culture, because I'm almost certain that you have the same impulse as I do. Whereas if Q is small, we have a weak culture. Perhaps we live in a culturally diverse society. So my own impulse is not very informative of what your impulse might be. So back to the problem of coordination. So how does this dichotomy play out here? Now here we have the very simple game again. And the theory shows that in this game, in this very simple setting, people act on impulse. So why is that? Well, suppose that I have an impulse to choose action 2, perhaps because it's salient to me. Now, if you and I grew up in the same culture and were exposed to the same social and cultural patterns, we're likely to have the same mental models. So it's likely, more likely than not, that you have the same impulse as I do. So in the language of the model, Q is greater than 1/2. But that means that it's optimal for me to act on impulse. Because if I choose action 2, it's more likely than not that your impulse is to choose action 2. So it gives, choosing action 2 gives me a payoff of greater than 1/2. Whereas if I switch to action 1, I expect a payoff that's less than 1/2, because I think it's unlikely that you have an impulse to choose action 1. Now, the same is true, of course, for you. So most of the time we end up coordinating on one of the actions. Now, the important implication is that in this case, it's better to have a strong impulse. Why is that? Well, the more mental models we share, the higher Q, and that means that there's a higher probability that we actually coordinate. So there's a higher probability that we end up on the diagonal where we get a positive payoff rather than off diagonal where we get nothing. So in this case, strategic uncertainty, so uncertainty about what other people might do, is actually bad. So having a shared culture can be beneficial, but can it also hurt? Now for that, we need to go back to a game that is close to what Keynes had in mind, where some outcomes are better than others. Now first, suppose that there's a very strong culture. So I'm very, very certain that you have the same impulse as I do. So again, suppose that I have an impulse to choose action 2. And because we have, we grew up in the same culture, I'm almost certain you have the same impulse. So that means that if I choose action 2, I expect a payoff that's close to 1. Whereas if I choose action 1, I expect a payoff that's close to -1. So of course I'm going to go with action 1, and so do you, and we end up getting 1 rather than 5. So so the problem with a strong culture in this case is that because there's no strategic uncertainty, social expectations trump payoffs. So that this becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think you're going to choose action 2. So I'm going to choose action 2, and so do you, and we end up in a bad outcome. So what happens if we don't have a strong culture, so the culture is weaker, perhaps the society is more diverse. Now, in that case, there's more uncertainty about what other people might do. So in the language of the model, my Q is close to 1/2. So I have an impulse to choose action 2. But in that case, the payoff I expect to get from choosing action 2 is only close to 1/2. So 1/2 times 0, 1/2 times 1. So what if I choose action 1? Well, in that case, the payoff I expect to get is actually 4. 1/2 times 5 minus 1/2 times 1. So that's 4 is better than 1/2. So so we end up, you go through the same reasoning, we both end up choosing action 1, even if we have an impulse to choose the other action. So because there is strategic uncertainty, because I don't know what your impulse is going to be, payoffs can trump expectations. In a way, there's less pressure to conform. And that means that in this case, uncertainty is beneficial. We're better off because we coordinate on a good outcome rather than getting locked into a bad outcome. So the key insight is that in this setting, culture both enables and constrains, which is actually a classic insight from sociology. And in this economic model, it occurs because there's really 2 types of coordination problems rather than 1. So one is to minimize the risk of miscoordination. So we want to choose the same action. We don't want to end up choosing different actions. But the second problem is that we want to avoid inefficient lock-in. We want to coordinate on the right outcome, not on a bad outcome. So in the context of Keynes' example, we want to choose the investment with a good fundamental investment, even of course, if we also want to choose investments that are popular. And the insight is that the trade-off is resolved very differently in different economic settings. So in this example, no action stands out in terms of payoffs because it's equally good to coordinate on action 1 as it is to coordinate on action 2. So in this case, the priority is to minimize miscoordination. And that means that a strong homogeneous culture is beneficial because it means that there's less strategic uncertainty and therefore less miscoordination. But in other games, some action may stand out in terms of payoff. So here, action 1, coordinating on action 1 is definitely better than coordinating on action 2. And then the priority is to avoid inefficient lock-in. We don't want to get locked into an outcome where we both choose action 2 just because we think that other people choose that action. And in that case, a weak culture is beneficial because a weak culture means that there's more strategic uncertainty, there's lots of behavioral variation, and that means that there's less pressure to conform. So this is a very simple dichotomy, yet it yields universal insights. So my collaborators and I have applied these ideas to a range of settings, more than I can list here. And the theory explains why culturally diverse societies are less conformist, but at the same time, they may get stuck in a low trust trap. So they don't, people in a diverse society feel less pressure to conform. At the same time, the miscoordination that can occur can lead to less trust. The theory can also shows why companies with a strong culture may fail to adopt superior work practices when the economic environment changes. But at the same time, companies with a strong culture outperform companies with a weak culture when the environment is more stable. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, we can go well beyond economic settings. Because remember, the idea is really that behavior is driven by theory of mind. So what people think about what other people think. So we wanted to know how people on the autism spectrum behave compared to more neurotypical people. Because autism is characterized by an impairment in perspective taking abilities, so problems with theory of mind. And what we found is exactly what the theory predicted. So individuals with autism outperform neurotypical people, in games where it's important to avoid inefficient lock-in, because autism means that it's harder for them to take other people's perspective, and that's a good thing if you want to avoid inefficient lock-in. At the same time, neurotypical people outperform people with autism in games where no action stands out in terms of payoffs, because there it's really important to avoid miscoordination.